Let's look at how we can UV a simple polygon model and then bring the UV snapshot into GIMP and create a simple texture. So here you can see I've got a very plain basic model that I've created using 3D Studio, and really it's just a series of extrudes using the Edit Poly modifier, and it's actually based off of this image that I found on the internet. So what I'm going to try and do is simply create a texture that sort of mimics this rustic metal look. So we'll see what we can do. A quick note on how I created this. You'll notice that it's actually made of two separate pieces. So if I use my move tool, you can see that I can select the outer body, which is the main case, and then the inner section is actually these pieces of glass. And the reason I've done that is so that I can actually control more easily the different textures or the different materials that I place on these objects. So I can get my glass to be sort of translucent or transparent, and then still have my metal texture on the outside frame. So the first thing I need to do is actually use the Unwrap UVW modifier, and normally you might expect to just select one of these objects and apply the modifier. However, because I'm actually looking to create one single texture map that I can apply to both of these objects, what I'm going to do is select both of my objects together and then apply the Unwrap UVW modifier down here. Once I've applied that, that modifier now applies to both of these objects together. And what I need to do is actually click on the Open UV Editor button. And that shows me what my UVs currently look like. Let's move that over here. So I need to unwrap this object and get it flat so it appears in flat UV texture space, so I can then create a texture and then rewrap that around the model again. So first of all, you'll notice that my UVs look totally blank, pretty useless right now. So what I can do is actually use my face or polygon selection mode, and I'm going to pick up, just drag a region around everything, and you'll notice that's picked up all of the polys that make up both these objects. Now it's worth noting that everything that we create has to sit inside this square because that's my UV texture space. So the quickest way to make sense of the UVs for this object is to do a simple explode. I like to use this flatten over here, this rightmost button. If you click on that, it separates your objects out by pieces, and some of them are still joined and some of them are being completely separated. And if I select individual pieces now, you can see where they belong. So that's that piece of glass. That, if I turn this around, is that piece of glass, and this section here is kind of the roof. In fact, if I draw a region around that, you can see that this piece here is this roof section here. So what I need to do really is try and make sense of how to start stitching this back together again. I could export this UV map just like this, with all these separate pieces, only it would be much harder to paint the seams. So, for example, where the roof here joins onto the body here, how do you paint that seam from one piece of geometry to the next when the two pieces are at completely different locations on the map? It's really quite difficult to do that. So stitching it together allows us to create as few seams or separations between the faces as possible, and that's really the end goal here. So first of all, what I might do is just pick up my pieces of glass, use my move tool up here, and just push these off to the side. Try and create some space for myself. And then I think I'll grab the roof pieces, just collect those together. If you make any mistakes, you can just Control Z to undo. So here's my roof pieces for the top. And these pieces here are my side pieces that go around the glass. So what I would be inclined to do, and there's a few different ways you could stitch this together, but what I'd be inclined to do is actually try and rebuild one side of this. So stitch the side piece to the roof piece, and I think that would make it easier to paint that seam. So if we look under the roof piece here and find that polygon, you'll see that it's actually joined. If I control select all these pieces, all of that underside lip, it's actually joined together as one piece, which is not going to make this too easy, and I'll show you why. So to stitch something together, I'm going to go to my edge selection mode, select the edge that I would like to join. My edge goes red, and the corresponding edge that it should join to goes blue. So you can see that those two should be joined together. I'm going to use my stitch custom. If I click on this button here, you can see how it stitches that underside lip to the roof piece here. Now that poses a problem, because the next thing I'd like to do is stitch this piece here to the corresponding side panel. And you can see that that's that blue piece there. So if I stitch those together now, we've created a problem. Yeah, this seam goes nicely from top to bottom now, but you can see how it's overlapping with the underside lip here. So what I would be inclined to do here is actually detach by control selecting these seams here, and I'm going to detach those to separate each of these underside lips. So I'm going to click on the break button here to break those apart, and then I can simply click on my polygon selection tool and I can just break these apart now. I can separate them out. Alright, very good. And what I might do is just move this section out of the way so it's easier to see. So now I'd like to stitch on the bottom section. I'm going to stitch from here to the underside. So I'm going to select my edge selection tool, select that bottom seam. You can see that that's the underside of the lamp, and simply click on stitch, and it'll bring that together. So it's starting to make a bit more sense now. This piece here, you can see in the 3D view, is that side and underside there. And so all I need to do now is find the other edges and start stitching them together, and you can see that the lamp starts to appear as an exploded object. I can grab these edges here and stitch those. Those are those edges that I broke apart earlier from the underside. Stitch those together and keep moving around the object and stitching things together. Stitch. It's picking up all these separate pieces and starting to bring these together as one. So we're just left with a few pieces now, which make up the top side of this. Now the problem is, what happens if I try and stitch this next piece together? You can see that we've got another lip. If I zoom in on that, in fact, let's view this in wireframe mode. Let's see, where is this? Let's grab this polygon here. You can see that this lip is this underside here. So I need to do the same thing. I need to break that apart into 4 sections so that I can stitch everything together. So I'll go to my edge tool, grab these sections here, 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 and here, and then I'll just use my break to separate those. And again, now I can actually just pull these polys aside, and I'm left with just the lip that I want. That piece is left in there. I'll just leave that there for now. So I'll go to my edge mode again, and we'll continue stitching this together. Same thing. There's another lip that we need to deal with. So I'll just control select each of these and break this apart. And this very much is a case of trial and error. Just practicing what works, what doesn't work for each of your objects. And each object is different, and really just through practice you tend to get a better grasp of how to break apart and then rebuild an object. It just gets easier with experience. And so lastly, I'm left with that top piece, which is this top piece here. So all I need to do is just move around the object, stitch these back together again, and then this piece, and finally this piece down here. And let's see, we've got a little bit left over. What is that? Looks like I've left off, oh, I didn't finish off this last piece here. There we go. So my lantern's been unfolded now, and I've got my lantern here, and I've got the glass pieces here. And so the last thing I need to do is actually arrange these neatly within my UV texture space. So before I do that, we need to talk a little bit about scale. It's worth noting that you can preview this temporary checker pattern on your object to get an idea of where it's stretching and where your UVs need to be corrected. And to do that, all you need to do is click on the drop down up here and select checker pattern. And if you do that, you can see that the checkers, as they are laid out on these objects, let's bring these into the checker view so it makes more sense. These checkers, as they're laid out on my object in 2D space, now translate into the 3D view. And they do that, they actually repeat even in this gray area here. And that's useful because if I were to do something like scale up these UVs, you can see that they occupy more texture space now, and because of that, the checkers become much smaller than the glass. Now, it's best practice to actually try and get the checkers to be the same size across all of your objects. So I'm actually going to undo that command, and you can see that my checkers match up pretty nicely. But if you get a mismatch, you can just use the scale command to adjust those checkers. So if you get those that resolution off slightly, then what happens is that the high resolution areas look much more detailed than the low resolution areas. And sometimes that's used in video games where they want the faces of a character to occupy more texture space and have more detail, and maybe the body occupies less and has less detail. It really depends on the project. So what I'm going to do now is arrange these so they fit neatly inside my texture space. So I'm just going to grab everything, and I'm going to scale everything down uniformly. And then just move, first of all, my lantern body into here, and you can see it's too big, so I'm going to scale it down a bit more. You want it to fit as close to those seams as possible, close to those edges. And then what I'll do is I'll just grab my pieces of glass and just arrange those into the texture as well. A good texture artist will actually have very little wasted UV space. So you can see that my map, while it was easy to create here, also generates a lot of wasted space. So a different layout could actually give me a more optimized map. But for this example, this will work just fine. So now that I've arranged my UVs, and I'm happy with those, I've unwrapped my 3D object, all I need to do now is export this as a template, and I'm able to use this in my image editing software to create a texture. So I'm going to select my polys, go to Tools, and Render UVW Template. And once I've done that, I can select the size of the texture that I'd like to export. And for this texture, I'm going to do just 1024. And we're going to leave everything else at the defaults and click Render UV Template. And what it does is it actually renders out your template to a render view. And all you need to do now is simply save this template out by clicking on the Save button and decide where you want to put this. Now I've created a project folder for my lamp, so I'm going to place this inside my Scene Assets folder, and I'm going to put it inside Images and I'll call this lamp UV template. I like to use PNGs for my image format, so we'll see, let's find PNG, click Save, and RGB 24-bit will be just fine, and click OK. And so in the next video what we'll do is we'll actually paint a texture for the lamp so that we can then later bring that back into Max and have the finished result.